Okay, so today we're really diving deep into something that I think we hear a lot about, but maybe don't always fully understand, substance-related and addictive disorders.
And this document is great because it really gets into like all the different aspects of it.
It really does. It's like we hear addiction is a disease, but this goes way beyond that, like really breaking down the how and the why, which I think is so important.
Yeah, and it kind of like takes away that stigma that can be associated with addiction, right? Like it's not a choice, it's not a moral failing, there's actual science behind it.
Right. And speaking of science, I was really interested in this whole idea of the biosocial model. It's
Yeah.
like this interplay between, our biology and our environment and how they sort of work together.
It's like imagine this, right? Your brain has this reward system, and for some people, because of their genes, certain substances, they act like a key. They unlock these like really intense, pleasurable effects.
Oh, wow.
And so that makes them more vulnerable to addiction. So that's like the biology side.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then how does environment play into all of this?
So let's say someone grows up and they see substance use all around them in their family, their community. It becomes normalized.
Right, it's like just part of life.
Exactly. And then you add things like stress, lack of opportunity, poverty, suddenly using substances. It's not that hard to see why someone might go down that path.
That's a perfect storm.
Right.
And some people, they're just more vulnerable to it because of their genes. Now, this document also talked about specific behaviors related to alcoholism. And I think this is where it can get tricky because those early signs, they're not always super obvious, are they?
No, they can be really subtle, actually. Like one of the things they talk about is this thing called growing tolerance. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, so like needing more and more to get that same feeling.
Exactly. So, one glass of wine used to do it, but now you need three or four to feel the same effect. And as that tolerance builds, that's when you get into like dependence and withdrawal.
And withdrawal, that's when things can get really scary, right?
It can be pretty bad. Think about the worst hangover you've ever had and then times that by like 10. Anxiety, the shakes, you can't sleep.
Oh, that sounds horrible. So then people just drink more to make those feelings go away, and it becomes this vicious cycle.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to catch it early. The sooner the better, because then you can get people the support they need before things escalate.
Which kind of brings us to diagnosis.
Mhm.
I mean, is there like a test for addiction, or is it more complicated than that?
It would be nice if it was that simple, but it's actually more like putting a puzzle together.
Yeah.
This document talks about the DSM-5, which is kind of like the, I guess, the official manual that clinicians use to diagnose mental health disorders.
So they use that and they talk to the person, maybe talk to their family to kind of get a full picture of what's going on.
Exactly, because everyone experiences addiction differently. So it's about understanding their individual story, how they're using substances, and any other mental health issues that might be playing a role.
That makes so much sense because, like you wouldn't treat a broken leg the same way you treat a heart problem.
Exactly.
You need that like personalized approach.
100%. And that's what this document is really pushing for, moving away from those one-size-fits-all solutions and towards treatment that's tailored to the individual.
So when we talk about treatment, like the first thing that pops into my head is rehab, right? Like, is that kind of what we're talking about here, or is there more to it?
Well, rehab is definitely one option, but it's not the only one. And this document does a really good job of sort of laying out this whole spectrum of treatment options that are out there.
Okay, so like, what else is there besides rehab?
So you've got things like inpatient care, which is basically what you're describing with rehab, where someone lives at a facility, they're there 24/7.
Got it. So that's for people who probably need a little bit more like structure, right? A little bit more support. Maybe they're not ready to be out in the real world just yet.
Exactly. They need to be removed from their triggers, get that intensive support, and really just focus on their recovery.
Okay, that makes sense. What about those therapeutic communities I've heard about? Are those kind of like a halfway point, or are they something totally different?
They can be a bit both, actually. They offer that residential setting, but there's a really big emphasis on like peer support and personal accountability. It's like a community of people in recovery, all living together, supporting each other. They might even have responsibilities within the community, like running things.
Wow, so it's like a built-in support system. That's got to be really powerful. Now, I'm curious, like beyond the setting itself, what are some of the actual therapies that are used to treat addiction? I've heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that something that's used a lot?
Oh, yeah. CBT is huge in addiction treatment. It's all about like recognizing those negative thought patterns and behaviors that contribute to addiction.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, how would that actually work for someone who's, say, struggling with alcohol addiction?
Okay, so let's say someone's trying to cut back on drinking and they get home from work, they've had a really stressful day, and their first thought is, I deserve a drink.
Right, like, I've earned this.
Exactly. CBT helps them challenge that thought. It helps them see it as a trigger and then come up with other healthier ways to cope with that stress.
So instead of reaching for that glass of wine, maybe they, like, go for a run, call a friend, meditate, something like that.
Exactly. It's about rewiring those automatic responses, you know? And the great thing about CBT is it gives people these tools that they can use even after therapy's over.
It's like you learn how to retrain your brain a little bit, which is amazing.
Mhm.
And this kind of ties into what this document called a holistic approach, right? Like, it's not just about the addiction itself, but it's about looking at the whole person.
Exactly. A holistic approach will definitely include therapy, but it also looks at things like nutrition, exercise, managing stress, even spirituality.
Right, because you're not taking care of yourself physically, or if you're, like, super stressed out all the time, that's going to make it so much harder to recover.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. It's like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. You got to strengthen that foundation first.
Totally. Now, something else that really stuck out to me in this document was the emphasis on support systems. Because it's true, right? You can't really do this alone.
You absolutely cannot. Having a strong support system can make or break someone's recovery. And it doesn't have to be like this big formal thing. Sometimes it's just having that one person, you know, that you can call, that you can talk to, that will listen without judgment.
Someone who just gets it.
Yeah.
So family support, I imagine, is really crucial. But how do families find that balance between being supportive and also, not enabling the addiction?
That is the million-dollar question, right? It's a tough one. It's about setting boundaries, but also offering encouragement and understanding.
Okay, so what does that look like in real life?
So like instead of shielding their loved one from the consequences of their actions, if they mess up because of their addiction, families can encourage them to take responsibility for that.
Well, own it, yeah.
Right. Or instead of like constantly lecturing them, just have open and honest conversations, Create a safe space where they feel comfortable actually asking for help.
So it's about moving away from blame and shame, which I think can be really hard, especially with family, because those emotions are so intense. It's about coming from a place of love and support. Now, family is huge, but it's not the only resource. Right? This document also talked about the importance of community support. What are some of the things people can tap into?
Oh, there are so many resources out there. Support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous are amazing because they offer that sense of community, that shared experience, which can be incredibly healing.
To know you're not alone.
Yeah.
That other people understand what you're going through because they've been there too. It's got to be so powerful.
Absolutely. And then there are peer recovery programs, which are often run by people who are in recovery themselves. So they bring that lived experience to the table, which is so valuable.
It's like having a guide, someone who's already walked that path and can help you navigate it. Now, I imagine with all of these resources, it can also be kind of overwhelming, right? Like, where do you even start?
You're telling me. It's a lot to process. That's why it's so important to have that strong support system, whether it's a therapist, a friend, a family member, someone who can help you make sense of it all.
Yeah, it's like having someone in your corner, someone to help you navigate all the options and figure out what's going to work best for you.
Absolutely. Because, recovery, it's not always easy. And this document, it doesn't shy away from the tougher aspects of it, like stigma and relapse.
Yeah, stigma. That's such a tough one. I mean, we're talking about judgment, shame, people being afraid to ask for help because they're afraid of what others will think.
It's true. And this document really highlights how stigma can be this invisible barrier that keeps people from getting the support they desperately need.
Because who wants to admit they're struggling when they're just going to be, judged or shamed for it?
Exactly. And what's really sad is that because of stigma, a lot of people don't reach out for help until things have gotten really, really bad.
Which makes it all the more important to talk about this openly and honestly, right?
Yeah.
To create a culture where people feel safe asking for help.
100%. We need to shift that conversation, move away from blame and towards understanding and compassion, because addiction, it can happen to anyone. It doesn't discriminate.
Absolutely. And then there's the other big one that nobody really wants to talk about, relapse.
Right. It's like this big, scary R word. But this document, it approaches relapse with the sense of realism, you
Yeah.
know? Like, it's not necessarily a sign of failure, but it's something that you need to be prepared for.
It's a possibility, for sure.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that everything's off track.
Yeah. Exactly. It might just mean that something in your recovery plan needs to be adjusted. Maybe there's a new stressor in your life or a coping mechanism that's not working anymore.
So it's like a chance to regroup, reassess, and maybe tweak things a bit, not give up entirely.
Exactly. And that's why having a relapse prevention plan is so important, you know? Having those tools in place to deal with those triggers and urges when they pop up.
Okay, so let's talk about those tools. Like, what are some things that people can do to stay on track when those cravings hit?
Well, the first step is really all about knowing yourself. Knowing your triggers, the people, the places, the situations that make you more vulnerable to relapse.
So if you know your kryptonite, you can at least, like, try to avoid it or have a plan for when you can't.
Right. And, you know, a lot of times those triggers, they're linked to stress. So having healthy coping mechanisms in your back pocket is key.
Yeah, so we're talking exercise, mindfulness, spending time in nature, those sorts of things.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you and building a sustainable toolkit that you can rely on long term. Because recovery, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Right. It really is. It's a journey.
Yeah.
And it sounds like from this document that it's a journey that's full of hope, too.
It absolutely is. I mean, every day, people overcome addiction and go on to live these amazing, fulfilling lives. And that's a message we need to be sharing more of.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive on substance-related and addictive disorders, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
You know, if there's one thing I hope people remember, it's this. Addiction is not the end of your story. Recovery is possible. It's a journey. And with the right support, with compassion for yourself and from others, you can overcome this. There is so much hope out there.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to that point, to our listeners, if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that you're not alone. Reach out. There is help, there is hope, and things can get better. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everybody.